So many people worry about donor conception. They often worry about things like, how is the donor going to feel about my children? How is the donor going to feel about me? Will relationships develop with her or with her children over time? Should I connect with donor conceived siblings over time? And there's so much confusion and stress around these areas. So today I'm going to help you by giving you this information through some hard research published by a woman named Leah Gilman. She's a researcher and sociologist in England and studies these exact questions. So tune in today because I think you'll be really interested in the information that she shares with us. Welcome to Building Your Family. This is a podcast about donor conception, fertility treatment, surrogacy, and all the ways the modern family is built. My name's Lisa Schumann. I'm your host. I'm an author, a researcher, a therapist, and I'm here to share with you valuable information on how to build your family and how to have a wonderful journey and a wonderful parenthood experience. And today I'm going to talk about both of those things with regard to donor conception with our guest, Dr. Leah Gilman. She is a fantastic researcher whose information I stumbled upon online, and I was amazed by all of the incredible discoveries she's found in donor conception and thought that I should share them with you because they are so valuable to understand. If you are pursuing donor conception or you know someone who's pursuing donor conception, it's really helpful to understand this information because there's so much confusing information out there. So I want to welcome Leah Gilman, and she will introduce herself. Hi, Leah.
Hi, Lisa. Thank you so much for having me on the podcast. So I am a research fellow. I work at the University of Sheffield in the UK, and I'm a sociologist. So my work, it kind of overlaps medical sociology and sociology of the family. And it's very much been focused on donor conception for the last 10 years or so. And I'm especially interested in processes of social change and how they relate to donor conception. So some of the things that my research has looked on, the move to an ethic of openness in donor conception. In the UK, that came with changes in the law. So the abolition of absolute donor anonymity. And we have something called identity release legislation in the UK now. So donor conceived people can find out who their donor is at the age of 18. So that kind of social change. I've done research around DNA testing, commercial DNA testing, and the impact that that's had. And my current project is all about mediatization, so the expansion of digital technologies and platforms in our society and what that means for donor conception as well.
That's fantastic. Well, as I mentioned to you earlier before we started, I have been going through all of your research and I have, reams of articles that I could talk about ad nauseum. And I'm sure the listeners can't sit for as long as I'd like them to listen to it because there's just so much there. So let's focus on some things that I feel could be really helpful. After seeing so many donors and recipients after so many years, I know that there are certain things that people worry about, that they feel concerned about, and also that they're curious about because donor conception is, as you're saying, evolving. And as we're moving to a more open idea about donor conception, we are also changing our ideas about family and about connections. And so I think it's really helpful for people to understand that so that it doesn't sound so scary. It doesn't sound so anxiety producing, and that they really have some insight into how the donor's feeling, how the recipients are feeling, and how the donor conceived are feeling. So I was thinking about starting perhaps with the donor. People wonder, if I use donor conception, how is the donor going to feel about me, about my children? How do they see me and my children? How do they see their donation? So could we start there with a little bit of research on that?
Yeah, I guess as a sociologist, probably the biggest thing that I would say is who becomes a donor, who becomes a sperm or egg donor, and how they feel about donation, how they make sense of it. That is all really dependent on the kind of context in which that donation is taking place, right? There's the laws, there's the policies, there are kind of wider cultural understandings of family that all kind of feed into who even comes forward to be a donor in the first place, and then how they think about being a donor and what that means as well. But kind of with that caveat, the research that I have conducted with donors is primarily with donors who are donating in a context where there's an identity release legal context to that. And so they've been recruited in a context which says, being a donor is not being a parent, but donor conceived people nevertheless might be interested in contacting you one day. You might end up meeting them one day. So they've kind of signed up for that. And one of the things that parents, recipient parents, or people who are interested in donor conception often ask me is, well, how do the donors feel about that? And I think often there's an assumption, or there certainly was prior to the law change, that donors wouldn't want this, that they wouldn't offer to donate in a context where they would be contactable. So the first thing, I suppose, is that hasn't turned out to be the case in the UK, that there are people who are willing to donate in that context. But at the same time, from my research, one of the things that came through really strongly in that research that I've done, and also with Petra Nordqvist on the Curious Connections project, is that they're happy to be contacted, but they don't think of themselves as a parent. And for very often, that's the line that donors make between what it means to be a donor is by definition that you're not wanting to be a parent in that situation. And as I guess you can imagine, really emphasize that things that make you a dad or a mum are changing the nappies and waking up in the night and doing all of the hard work that it takes to kind of get to really be called somebody's mum or dad. So they're fully signed up about that. And then how they kind of make sense of, I guess that kind of leaves this question, right? So you're not their parent, but the law's changed to say that you might be contacted. So that implies there's something going on there that's significant in some way, which leaves a question to say, well, what is your role if it's not a parent? What is it? What does it mean to be a donor in that context? And there was quite a range of possibilities that donor talked about in that scenario. But the thing that came through really strongly for just about every donor we spoke to was this idea that whatever it is not up to me, that role is going to be led by the recipient family. And it varied a bit between donors who would kind of emphasize more the parent's role in deciding that. And that was especially the case if you had someone who was a known donor from the start. So they've got a connection with the parents from the outset. They would say, well, my role is whatever they say they want or what they say the child needs. They're the parents. So I'll drop in and see them once a year if that's what they want. I'll have a phone call if they've got a question about some kind of genetic issue. Whatever it is very responsive. And then with those that were unknown to the recipient, so potentially being contacted in 18 years' time, that was often talked about the donor conceived person. So if that donor conceived person contacts me, that's up to them. What the relationship might be is up to them. They might want to just meet me one time. They might want to meet me multiple times. And what I guess maybe is surprising is how open donors were to quite a really wide range of relationship possibilities that might arise from that. But I guess the kind of uniting factor was it's not really my decision. And of course, for the identity release donors, they might never be contacted at all. Yeah, that was a kind of uniting factor, I think, amongst pretty much all of the egg and sperm donors that we interviewed.
That's so important, I think, because so many parents or parents-to-be go into this thinking, my donor has this agenda, my donor is going to want to be a parent, my donor is going to want to be very involved in my life. And then I meet with the donors, and the donors say the same thing about the recipients, like, I'm happy to do this, but I want to kind of go on with my life, and I hope that they don't expect me to be a parent. And of course, neither one of those scenarios comes to pass, right? Their greatest fears are not realized. And yet there is that fear nonetheless. And so I think it's so valuable, this research that you're producing, Leah, because it's so important for parents to understand that the donors are going into this with their full heart. They want to give, they want to help another family, and yet they are also seeing their role as a donor as being very different than being a parent.
Yeah, I would say on the whole, that's come through really strongly. And I guess it kind of points to one of the challenges, I suppose, of being a donor in this context where you might be contactable, whether that's DNA testing or whether that's because of the law where you're donating, is that it is we talk about it being unscripted. So there's not a social script of how you are meant to behave in a context where you're meeting a child conceived from your sperm donation for lunch. Like, what do? Do you hug? Do you shake hands? How long do you stay? What do you talk about? Like, all of the kind of social conventions through which we kind of manage day-to-day life are a bit kind of out the window.
Yes.
Interestingly, actually, you might be interested in this, is that one of the ways I found with my PhD research, one of the ways that donors manage that completely unscripted situation that often they were just imagining, they've not necessarily gone through it, but they're thinking this could happen in the future, how am I going to navigate this, is when they had their own children, a lot of the kind of scripts or conventions that they draw on are based on the relationship between their raised children and the children that are conceived from the donation. So for some people, they would think of this as a kind of sibling type connection. Other people would frame it more in terms of it's a bit like cousins. But that gave them that seemed to be a sort of safer language to use to frame it, because they were very rejecting of this being a parental connection. But it also gave them some ideas of how they might behave. So they would kind of really emphasize, the children might be interested to meet one another. They might want to talk to each other. I really remember one egg donor who I said, well, what would you actually, she was imagining this scenario in which the donor conceived person from her egg donation had come to the house, and they were meeting them for the first time. I said, what would you actually do in that scenario? What would happen? And she said, and maybe I'd sort of like line them up with my kids and, see if there was any resemblances, or we'd see who was the tallest, or, she was kind of drawing on those conventions of, this is what you might do with your cousins. This is what you might do with your brothers and sisters to navigate that totally unknowable situation, really.
Well, that's so interesting. And, we had Rosanna Hertz on here before talking actually about that. And that I think that's so fascinating because we don't live in a world that has norms for this sort of relationship, right? And so our minds go to, well, how do I see that person?
Yeah.
And I think for our viewers, it may also be very reassuring to understand that the donors may say, well, my child has a genetic relative, maybe see them as a sibling or see them as a cousin, but not thinking, oh, that's my child. They're thinking more of a relationship between their child and somebody else and kind of moving forward with that. And that's kind of guiding their direction about how they should behave in that relationship with that in mind rather than a parental role.
Yeah.
So interesting. You mentioned in one of these papers that there's some, or in some of your research, that there was some difference between the egg donors and the sperm donors.
So the kind of research that we've done, it's not quantitative, so it's hard to kind of draw these comparisons and draw kind of really neat conclusions from it.
Right.
But from the Curious Connection study, we found that there was sort of contemporary donors in this kind of more open context. There was sort of two key moral cornerstones to being a donor for them. So very much on the one hand, you are helping other people become parents. So you're creating parents. And in order to create parents, you kind of have to like know your place. You're a donor, you're not a parent. Let them get on with being parents. That's sort of what it means to help someone else be a parent, is that you aren't involved, that you let them do this. That's what you're giving. But in the kind of contemporary donor conception world, at least in the UK, there's also a sort of moral kind of emphasis on the fact that you are also making people. So yes, you're helping other people make parents, but you're also making people, you're making donor conceived people, and donor conceived people might have particular needs or rights, and your role as a donor is also to kind of respond to that in some way, hence the introduction of identity release legislation. And we found that I'm getting to the gender differences here. So
yeah, sure.
we found that the sort of gender difference came around the emphasis that people put on those different aspects, there's different moral aspects of being a donor, because there could be some tension between them. So, for example, when we spoke to donors about things like resemblances, so they talked about, well, how would you feel if there was a physical resemblance between yourself and a donor conceived person conceived from your donation? If they were emphasizing the moral norm of kind of knowing your place, not interfering, letting parents be parents, donors would be, I'd be careful about resemblance, because I don't want to make a parent feel weird about the fact that maybe I've noticed that we've got the same shaped ears, or that someone's got the same eyebrows as my granddad. Like, I just wouldn't mention that because that might feel difficult for them. But then if they were emphasizing the kind of moral norms that go along with kind of making people, they would say, well, maybe this is exactly the sort of thing that donor conceived people might be interested in knowing about. I wouldn't say they were tense about it, but there was a balancing act going on with how you kind of navigate those two principles. And we found that sperm donors tended to put more moral emphasis on the importance of the kind of commitments that come with making people, so the interest of donor conceived people, and the egg donors would tend to put more emphasis on the importance of knowing their place and creating parents.
Oh.
That was something that came through in our research, but there is a bit of a caveat to that, which is that we spoke to more sperm donors who were known donors, who had donated sort of privately outside of clinics than we did. That obviously isn't possible for egg donors to donate outside of a clinic completely. And then on the egg donor side, we also spoke to a lot of egg share donors. So this is where people were having their own IVF and they donated half the eggs in exchange for reduced cost IVF. And we found that this group of donors, it was really strong how much they identified with the recipients of their donation. This was generally the case for egg donors, but especially for these egg share donors, because they knew that this recipient that they were donating to, who they didn't know, was having IVF treatment at exactly the same time as them. And so often they even had a child at exactly the same time as their recipient had a child, because they were having the treatment. So there was a really strong sense of parallel lives and connection and affinity with this woman that they'd never met, which I think, so it's not just the gender, it's the particularities of egg donation and the ways people become an egg donor that maybe leads to this stronger identification with the potential parents and the wanting to protect the parents, if that makes sense.
That's so interesting. My name is Lisa Schumann. I'm a therapist, a researcher, an author, and I am passionate about helping people find a better journey to parenthood. I created the Center for Family Building to help people understand how to make decisions, not just for the short term, but for a lifetime. We have group counseling, individual counseling, couples counseling, and lots of other services that can help people find the answers that they're looking for. Just take a look at our website so you can see a few of the thousands of people we helped build a better path to parenthood. The decisions you make are too important to leave up to chance. Arm yourself with the right information. Take a look at our website and sign up for a session with one of our therapists, join one of our groups, or access one of our programs, and you will quickly see why our strategies are so effective. Now back to our episode. So did those people were they conscious about, well, we're leading these parallel lives, so I have to be more careful about my role? Or were they thinking that they feel more connected?
Both, in a way. So I definitely think there was a stronger sense of connection and sense of affinity. And very often these egg donors, they would talk about, so some of them had been sent a gift or a letter from the recipient parent, and these were treasured possessions. One woman said, this is the thing I would get in a fire, this letter. Or someone else had worn the necklace that the recipient had gave during the birth of her own son. And so there's this really strong sense of connection, but it was a connection with that recipient. So that they would say, I'd love to meet them. I'd love to meet these people one day. I hope that they come and find me. But really, that's because I want to meet, I'm most interested in meeting her, in the sense that I'm interested in meeting the child conceived from my donation. It's because I'm interested in what the child means to the mother, to the families, but particularly to the mother of that child. And of course, then they identified with what it means to become a mother for the first time, because they often had been going through that themselves. Yeah, so it was a stronger sense of identification and kind of wanting to protect them, but that involved almost stepping away from any connection to the donor conceived person and really emphasizing the connection to the parent.
Yes. So I think that's really so important to think about, that you're saying that even though the people who have a different sort of experience donating, you're donating and then you're going to have children of your own, rather than being a young girl who's donating and then wants to travel the world or go back to school or whatever, that you have a different perspective on the donation. And yet in both of these cases, you're very cognizant, or kind of almost focused, and maybe even for the men as well, on the parent's experience, or the parent-to-be's experience, and less feeling like I'm connected to this child. You're
Yeah,
more interested in really thinking about the experience of the intended parents.
that's especially come through really strongly with the egg donors. I think with some of the sperm donors, what you said there about disconnecting to protect the recipient parents comes through more strongly in some of the sperm donor stories, because some sperm donors imagined that if they had donated to a heterosexual couple, so they're imagining a man who might be dealing with infertility,
Mm-hmm.
they sometimes imagined that it might be quite difficult for that man to meet them, the sperm donor. So they would maybe have more of an awareness of that. So for example, they'd say, look, it's totally up to the donor conceived person or the recipient parents if they want to get in touch with me. But I'm aware that could be difficult, because I know that this is a heterosexual couple that have used my donation, and they might not be that comfortable with it, and that's fine.
That's so interesting because, so many times on social media where there's a large emphasis naturally on the donor conceived person and how they're feeling, understandably. But then there's also an emphasis on the donor and how the donor's feeling. And the recipients sometimes are looked at as being not as important in that narrative, because they're pursuing what they want. And yet it's so interesting because the donors themselves are actually concerned about the recipients.
Yeah, I would say that donors are often concerned about recipients, and that's the imagined recipient, I suppose, is the driving factor for a lot of the donors that have taken part in our research. I guess this is in a context in the UK where there's very negligible kind of financial incentive to be a sperm or egg donor here.
Mm-hmm.
So the way that donation is marketed or advertised is about helping other people become parents. That's so donors may often have another reason on top of that why they might be interested in being a donor, but they've usually responded to that call that people
Yeah.
need donors to have families.
I mean, my experience in the U.S. has been similar. I opened an open donation program at a fertility clinic on the East Coast, which is normally not customary to have open donation in
Okay.
the East Coast. And we discovered that the donors really felt much more connected to the recipient's experience, particularly if they knew they were going to have some level of openness. Because,
Mm-hmm.
of course, when you go through this process and you're either looking at the faces of these people whose lives you're changing, or talking to them on the telephone, or having a Zoom call with them, now you place a face with your
Mm-hmm.
imagined experience. And then all of a sudden, this idea of this medical procedure is no longer just a medical procedure. You're seeing the faces of these people whose lives you're changing. And so the donors seem to feel much more strongly about the experience of the recipient, and also the whole process. So we have very similar experiences here.
That's interesting. So your program is where donors and recipients don't initially know each other, but through your program they they are introduced, and then so you do know the person you're directly donating to. That's really
Yes.
interesting, because that's not really something which is available here. So people can turn up to a clinic with a donor that they know, and that does happen particularly with egg donation. Like someone might say that ask their sister and then come to the clinic with
Right.
their sister or a cousin. If you don't turn up with a donor, essentially, then you are going to have an identity release donor, a clinic donor who they've recruited. And although it's open in the sense that the donor conceived person could one day contact the donor, or at least find out their details to try, there isn't a route through which recipients and donors can contact one
Connect.
another. And that's one of the things, even if they both want to. And that was one of the things that Petra Nordqvist and I, in the book Donors, that's one of our recommendations at the end, is that donors and recipients, well, from our book, it's focused on donors. Donors are often really interested in recipients. And if they're interested in them, they would several donors said to me, I just think it's wild that there's all these forms I've got to fill in. And there's not one box that I can just say, oh, if they want to ask me a question before 18, that's fine. Or if they want to
Yes.
send me an
Yes.
email, I'm fine with that, and in some ways, this connection with recipients can help people navigate that unscriptedness of that relationship to the donor conceived person. So I remember one egg donor, my PhD, she was saying she had a really strong sense of connection with the donor conceived person that had been conceived through her egg donation. But she said, he means so much to me because I know how much he means to his mom, because I have become friends with her. They weren't initially friends, but they became friends through the donation process. And that then helped her to, I guess it helps her to guide how she thinks about her relationship to that child. Does that make sense? So this,
yes, yeah, that's lovely.
enabling that relationship, it has potential. It's not for everyone. It's not the right route for everyone, but it has the potential to help people kind of navigate what can be a really unknowable situation.
Yes, absolutely. And we're, in the US, we're moving more towards that, and also updating medical information more frequently, because people get things, right? Even a young, healthy donor at 25 may get breast cancer at 30, may get, any other issue. And it's good for us to be able to stay abreast of that. But I think also, as you're saying, it's nice for the parents or parents-to-be to know about the donor and to be able to understand what their feelings are. There's so much stress here about the donor's rights and the donor being able to have those rights, but also I think it benefits everyone, the donors, the recipients, and the future children. I wonder often about these situations where they say, you're not going to have any contact until the child's 18. And then the donor all of a sudden has to be prepared. Okay, well, I donated at this time. And of course, if you're going to a sperm bank, you don't know when that sperm's going to be used, right? And so you're always wondering, when is the phone going to ring? When is this going to happen? And what is that going to mean? I could have children, I could have a family, I could leave the country, it's got to be very stressful, I would imagine, for the donors. What do you think about that, Leah?
I mean, we haven't been in a position where we've been. So last year was the year that the first donor conceived people conceived since the law change in the UK turned 18. So this law is only now just kind of beginning to kind of come to fruition, if you like. So it will be so interesting to follow those stories through research of people kind of making contact for the first time, or donors anticipating that contact. A previous project that that I was involved in was the connected DNA study. So that looked at people's experiences of using commercial DNA testing. There's some similarities there for the donors who have experienced being contacted through DNA testing, sometimes because they've uploaded their own DNA to the website, knowing that somebody might contact them, almost a way of making themselves open for contact for some donors. Some, completely surprisingly, being contacted because maybe their aunt or their dad or their brother is on one of these DNA testing sites, and so then the donor conceived person has matched that way and found them. I haven't had stories of people finding the waiting hugely stressful, apart from one story really stands out for me, which is that there was a donor who did discover that he had a genetic condition, essentially, and he donated in the UK before records were kept. So we're kind of going back to the 80s. It was quite a serious thing. He'd been quite unwell. His son had been quite unwell. And he tried everything, really, to try and make contact with anyone conceived from his donation so they could warn him, because there were things you could do if you were aware. So he was incredibly stressed about it. I mean, it's an incredibly stressful situation to feel, and he obviously had no idea at the time he donated, but, you know, feels a huge sense of kind of guilt and responsibility around this, that he didn't know, and now there's nothing that he can do about it.
Mm-hmm.
Another story stands out of somebody who was contacted out of the blue and then was just a really bad time, in the sense that his parent had passed away recently, so he was kind of managing grief and also just quite a lot of, I mean, there's the obvious grief when somebody dies, but he talked a lot about the admin and the work and the kind of labour, just being so incredibly busy and having no headspace to think about anything else. And that was the time in which somebody contacted him after a DNA testing match. So I guess, yeah, that's one of the difficult things, I suppose, is that it won't necessarily be at 18. It might be when that person's 30 or 40. And that's all assuming that they know they're donor conceived as well.
Yeah, it's so interesting. And what about if we kind of look at the other side of that? I know that you started to look a little bit at donor conceived individuals, but donor conceived individuals, most of them that you looked at, it seems like, were conceived when people were not disclosing.
Yeah, so that previous research about the DNA testing, so as part of that study, we interviewed donor conceived people most of whom had used DNA testing in relation to donor conception, or who were thinking about using DNA testing. And a high proportion of those people had anonymous donors. I mean, in fact, nearly all of them had an anonymous donor officially.
Right.
And then quite a high number of them were experiencing like late disclosure. So either they'd found out, let's say, through an argument or through a parent telling them kind of later in life that they're donor conceived. And then that's been the kind of spur to then think about using DNA testing. Or it wasn't at all. And as I'm sure you know, it's not an unusual experience for donor conceived people to take a DNA test, get given one as a gift, or just think that sounds fun. It's on offer online. And that's how they find out that they're donor conceived, because they get an unexpected match, or there isn't someone there that they expect to be connected to. And the story then comes out at that point.
Yeah, and we know in those cases where there's a late discovery or accidental discovery, that's when it's most stressful for the children.
Yeah. So as part of that research, that was often described as a kind of crisis point, people kind of reassessing their identity, serious kind of rupture in family relationships very often at that point. Although I would emphasize not necessarily irreparable damage as well, that can be a really hard conversation for people to have, and it's really difficult. But there were also stories where that had come out late in life and people were able to kind of rebuild, repair, maybe even kind of build their relationships with their parents from that point. And that seemed to happen where people kept talking, and where donor conceived people were often very understanding and very empathetic to the fact that their parents had normally been told, go home, have sex, forget about it, pretend it never happened. And they were following medical advice. And so I think donor conceived people often had a lot of empathy and understanding for their parents and the kind of context in which they were conceived, and that times have changed.
Yeah.
What they found difficult was when it wasn't unusual for donor conceived people to find out about the donor conception. A parent might eventually disclose, but then that would be the only conversation they ever had. So they would say, look, this is the story. They'd be very emotional, be very upset, the parent telling them, but then they wouldn't then check up with them like a week or 2 weeks later to see how they were getting on. Or in a few scenarios, they were told, look, this is what happened. Like, don't tell your dad, or please don't tell Gran, or
Wow.
in one case, please don't tell
Mm-hmm.
our family friends about this. So they then became the secret keepers. So there was one person where the siblings didn't know, and they were,
Oh, wow.
she knew they were also donor conceived, but was really in this really hard position. Then does she tell them or does she not tell them?
Wow.
So there are situations where this is a real ongoing rupture in family relationships. It's always going to be a shock, but there are also stories where people rebuild their family relationships. I suppose that's the kind of message I want to get across. And there is support for people in that situation where you have a late
Yes.
disclosure. It is possible to kind of move forward from here. But
Mm-hmm.
keeping talking about it seems to be really important.
Yes, so important. And I'm so glad that you're saying that, Leah, because even though I think that this idea of don't tell is a thing of the past, fortunately, and I don't think there's any program that's going to advise you not to tell your children. Everybody knows at this point, hopefully, that early and often is really ideal. But having said that, we also know it's never too late, right? That
Yeah.
there's always an opportunity to try, and that's true, I think, for all things in parenting, right? We all make
Yeah.
mistakes as parents, and the repair is so important in
Yeah.
that relationship. Repairing that problem is so important, and so even with the idea of disclosing late, parents get very nervous, as we're talking about, because they feel that the child will be angry with them, or that they're going to want to find the donor and run away with the donor, or they have these really scary fantasies.
Yeah.
And of course, none of those things come to fruition, but yet this is really how they feel, and so they put it off, and then they see on social media, well, you're a horrible person because you put it off, and so then they put it off some more because they're so afraid of talking about it. And so it's really important to kind of give them the permission to, release their fears and move forward in spite of the fact that they may be afraid, because ultimately, late disclosure is better than no disclosure, right? So it's always better to have that conversation.
Yeah. The research really supports that, definitely, that it is possible to move. It's definitely possible to kind of
Mm-hmm.
move forward from this. And you're right about the social media kind of context, that as important as that message is, that it's important to have this conversation, when you see that messaging from the point of view of a parent who hasn't told and their child is, say, 30 years old, you need to have that message along with, and here's how you can still talk about it,
Yes.
even if they've already found out and you've not had the chance to tell that story, to be the first person to tell that story. There still needs to be support for those people as well.
Yes. And I think that that's so important. As we're talking about this, it seems like in a lot of these scenarios, we're really talking about the idea that parents need to feel, or parents to be need to feel empowered, that everyone's got their back. We're here trying to support them. The donor wants to support them. The children want to love their parents and have a good relationship. And so there really is more power in their hands than they know. And it's important for them to understand that this is a beautiful way to build a family, and that this can all work out really nicely, and not to feel so afraid of it, because everyone is really here to support them. And I think, as you're saying, a lot of things will change. It'll be so interesting to see how the language changes with regard to donors and donor siblings, and how we start to look at these relationships, and how more, I don't know if this happens in the UK, but we're seeing more collaborative parenting relationships where maybe, a lesbian couple will have a male friend from college, and they'll say, we'd like him to be involved kind of as an uncle. And then I'm often seeing the person who wants to be an uncle say, this is a great situation for me because I don't want to be a parent, but I would love to be an uncle, and I would love to have that role in someone's life. And so that works for me. And so
Mhm.
I think we're going to see all sorts of family formations, over the decades. And, I'm very excited to see you study all of these things, Leah, because you have such fascinating insights.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm also very interested to see how it all plays out, definitely. The study that I'm working on at the moment is all about the internet, I suppose, and how that's transforming the possibilities in relation to donor conception. And so I think that really opens up a lot more space, I guess, for people to figure out the kind of range of different relational possibilities that can be involved in donor conception. And it might be on a bit of a spectrum from donor conception to co-parenting for some people. But that research is ongoing.
Oh, that's so interesting. And so is your research really looking at the relationships or discovery, or what is it really focused on?
So the current project that I'm working on is about when people arrange donor conception outside of fertility clinics in the UK. And in the UK, that's very much something that happens often with the help of websites or apps or Facebook groups where people are looking for a donor or looking for someone to donate to, but also just in communities and networks, and especially in the kind of queer community, people finding people through their own social networks, I suppose, not necessarily completely online. So yeah, there's at the minute it's early days with that research, and there's such a range of relationships I'm finding. I suppose there's more of a range than when we focused on the clinical donor conception side of things, in terms of how people negotiate what all of this means and how they're figuring it out amongst themselves. So I suppose that's what made me think of it, because maybe there is some insight there into how things might keep changing.
Yes, absolutely. And of course, as you know, we have to be so careful about that sort of thing. People finding people online or meeting people in, gas station bathrooms and all sorts of things, trying to get pregnant because donor sperm is very expensive. And so there is this kind of dark side to all of that we all have to be really mindful and careful about, I think, as we move forward in this process of building these extended relationships. So I'd be very excited to have you back, Leah, when you've completed this research, because we'll all be interested in hearing what those relationships look like.
Thank you. I'll be very happy to chat about it more.
Well, thank you so much for coming today, and thank you for your amazing insights, and thank you for your reassurance and everything that you do. I love your work, and I'm so excited to continue to stay in touch with you and hear more about these relationships and about donor conception. So thank you for coming.
Thanks for having me.
And how can people reach you, Leah?
So you can reach me via email. Is it helpful to share an email address?
Sure, yes,
or you could just, if you Google Leah Gilman, University of Sheffield, you'll find my web profile. It's probably the easiest way, and my email address will be on there. But it's l.gilman@sheffield.ac.uk.
Well, thank you so much for that. And all of you out there, please access Leah anytime. She has amazing insights and has done so much. We barely scratched the surface today, so I hope you reach out to her with all of your questions. And thank you so much for coming. We really appreciate your time and all of the thought that you put into this. This is a really important process. And of course, a lot of these decisions can't be unwound later. So it's really important to make sure that you do your homework, and Leah is a wonderful resource. So thank you again for coming, and please subscribe, because that's how we keep going. And I'll see you next time. Hi, it's Lisa Schumann. I hope that you enjoyed that video, and I hope it helped you. And if it did, please give us a thumbs up and subscribe, because that's how we keep going. It's really important to us. And if you liked it, you might like this one.